The sound of the doorbell jolted me out of my TV-induced trance. It wasn't just a sound. It was an interruption, a break in the comforting monotony I had built for myself. You know, the kind of monotony you desperately need when life has beaten you down. At first, I thought I might just ignore it. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it's not like I had people randomly dropping by. My circle was small now, by design. But the doorbell rang again. Persistent. Insistent. And if you've ever tried to ignore a noise, you'll know it's impossible once it grabs your attention. I sighed, pulled myself off the couch, and walked toward the door. You ever feel that weird mix of curiosity and dread? That's what I felt as I peeked through the peephole. And there she was. Rachel. I swear my heart stopped for a second. Or maybe it skipped a beat out of pure disbelief. I hadn't seen her in 2 years. Not a single call, text, or letter. Not that I wanted one. After everything that happened, I made it clear there was no coming back from it. And yet, there she was, standing on my doorstep as if the past had never happened. The first thought that hit me was, how the hell did she find me? I moved to a different state for a reason. I cut ties, left no breadcrumbs, and made sure I couldn't be tracked. Yet, somehow, here she was. It didn't make sense. For a moment, I considered going back to the couch and pretending I wasn't home. Maybe she'd give up and leave. But then I thought about it. Rachel wasn't the type to give up easily, and if she'd gone to the trouble of finding me, she probably wouldn't leave without whatever it was she came for. So, against my better judgment, I unlocked the chain and cracked the door open just enough for her to see my face. "What the hell do you want?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, well, as neutral as I could manage under the circumstances. She didn't flinch. "I need to talk to you," she said. I scoffed. "Talk to me? Really? You mean after the way you left? After everything? Rachel?" Her expression didn't change. "I don't even know why you left," she said. "I came home, and you were gone. No note. No explanation. Just gone." I stared at her like she'd grown 2 heads. She couldn't be serious. "You don't know why I left?" I said, disbelief dripping from every word. "You can't be serious. I told you what would happen if you walked out that door, and you did it anyway." She didn't blink. She didn't react. It was like she was playing the part of the innocent, wounded wife who just wanted answers. I wasn't buying it, but against every instinct I had, I unhooked the chain and opened the door. "Fine," I said, stepping aside. "Come in. Let's get this over with." Rachel walked in, her eyes scanning the room like she was taking stock of my new life. She sat on the couch, my couch, and asked for a glass of water, like this was some kind of casual visit. As I went to the kitchen, my mind raced back to the last time I saw her, to the night that changed everything. It was like a dam breaking, and memories came flooding back in full force. And for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't sure I had the strength to face her. But I handed her the glass of water anyway, because that's the thing about closure. It doesn't wait for when you're ready. You know, when you look back at the beginning of something, like a marriage, you wonder how you ever ended up where you are now. I handed Rachel her glass of water, and as she took a sip, I couldn't help but let my mind wander back to when we first started. Back when things were good, when love was simple and untainted by complications. Rachel and I were good together once. I don't mean just okay. I mean really good. We had what everyone else envied. Or so I thought. She had this laugh that could fill a room, and I swear, I could feel it echo in my chest every time. And me? Well, I wasn't perfect, but I tried to be the kind of guy who deserved a woman like her. For the first 7 years of our marriage, I thought I was succeeding. But there was one thing. One constant thorn in my side, Samantha. Samantha had been Rachel's best friend since grade school. You'd think that kind of history would mean something to me, and maybe at first it did. I wanted to like her for Rachel's sake. I really did. But Samantha was, how do I put this nicely? She was trouble. The kind of person who walked into a room and sucked all the air out of it. Loud, brash, always the center of attention. And not in a good way. You ever meet someone who just radiates bad decisions? That was Samantha. 4 divorces under her belt, all for the same reason. Cheating. And yet, somehow, she managed to keep convincing Rachel that she was just misunderstood. Misunderstood? That woman practically wore her chaos like a badge of honor. I'll admit, I tried to put up with her for Rachel's sake. For the first few years, I bit my tongue and played nice. But the more I learned about Samantha, the harder it became to keep quiet. Her wild parties, her revolving door of boyfriends, the rumors about what went on behind closed doors at her house. I didn't like any of it. And I didn't like that Rachel kept defending her, no matter what. "Get used to it, Sam," Rachel would say. "She's my best friend. She's been there for me through everything. I'm not going to turn my back on her just because you don't like her." It wasn't that I didn't like Samantha. Okay, maybe I didn't, but it was more than that. I didn't trust her. And when you're married, trust is everything. So yeah, it bothered me when Rachel spent time with her. It bothered me even more when she started going to Samantha's parties without me. I tried reasoning with Rachel. I really did. I told her what I'd heard about those parties, the drinking, the drugs, the other stuff. I didn't want to believe it, but there were too many stories for it to be nothing. "Just because she cheats on her husbands doesn't mean I'm going to cheat on you," Rachel said once, exasperated. "And just because she does things you don't approve of doesn't mean I'm doing them too. I'm my own person, Sam. Don't you trust me?" Trust. There's that word again. Of course, I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe that our marriage was strong enough to withstand Samantha's influence. But every time Rachel left for one of those parties, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from us. There was one moment that stood out, though. One argument that I keep replaying in my mind, even now. It was about 2 years before everything fell apart. Samantha had invited Rachel to another one of her infamous parties, and I told Rachel flat out that I didn't want her to go. "She's bad news," I said. "You know it, I know it, and deep down, I think you know that I'm right. Why can't you just distance yourself from her?" Rachel had looked at me then, and for a split second, I thought she was going to agree. But instead, she said, "She's my friend, Sam. My best friend. If you can't accept that, maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do." That line hit me like a punch to the gut. And it was the first time I realized that Samantha wasn't just a thorn in our marriage. She was a wedge. Sitting there now, with Rachel on my couch, I wondered if she remembered any of that. Did she know how hard I'd fought to keep us together? Did she know how much it hurt to watch her prioritize Samantha over me time and time again? Maybe she did. Or maybe she didn't. But as I looked at her, I realized it didn't matter anymore. There's something about the moment a relationship breaks that stays with you. You don't just remember the event. You remember the details. The sounds, the smells, the way the air felt heavier. That night was one of those moments for me. I came home from work exhausted but happy. It had been a long day, but I was looking forward to seeing Rachel. Maybe we'd have dinner, talk about our plans for the weekend. Just a normal evening, you know? But when I walked through the door, I knew something was off. Rachel was standing in the living room, dressed to the nines. And I don't mean her usual going out with friends, kind of dressed up. This was something else. She was wearing a black dress, tight, low cut, the kind of dress that makes heads turn. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled like she'd stepped out of a magazine. For a second, I just stared. I didn't even know what to say. "Do we have plans tonight?" I finally managed. She glanced at me, almost like she'd forgotten I existed. "No, I have a date." A date. That word hit me like a slap across the face. "With who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tom," she said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "He's new at work. He didn't want to go to Sylvia's birthday party alone, so I said I'd go with him." The calm way she said it, like this wasn't a big deal, was what made my blood boil. "You're going to a party with another man?" I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "A man you barely know? Dressed like that?" Rachel rolled her eyes, like I was being unreasonable. "It's not a date, Sam. He just needs someone to go with him. Besides, you hate Sylvia's parties, and I didn't want to go alone." That was the thing about Rachel. She could justify anything if it suited her. But this wasn't just about a party. This was about respect. Respect for me, for our marriage, for everything we'd built together. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked. "You're married, Rachel. Married to me. And you're walking out the door dressed like that for another man. How do you think that looks?" "It doesn't matter how it looks," she snapped. Nothing's going to happen, Sam. It's just a party. I should have stopped there. I should have let her walk out and dealt with the fallout later. But I couldn't. The words came spilling out before I could stop them. You know what happens at Sylvia's parties, I said. The drugs, the hookups. Don't pretend you don't know. You've been to enough of them. And now you're walking into that mess with a man who's clearly interested in you. Do you really think I'm going to be okay with that? Rachel crossed her arms, her expression hardening. You don't trust me. That's the real issue here, isn't it? You think just because Sylvia's life is a mess, I'm going to cheat on you. Well, newsflash, Sam. I'm not Sylvia. And if you can't see that, then maybe you don't deserve to be married to me. That was the moment. The breaking point. Don't go, Rachel, I said, my voice quieter now. Stay here with me. If you walk out that door, you're kissing this marriage goodbye. She hesitated, just for a second. I could see it in her eyes. She knew I was serious. But then she grabbed her purse, turned toward the door and said, Don't be ridiculous, Sam. This won't hurt us at all. Don't wait up. And just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a long time after she left. I don't know how long exactly. Long enough for the anger to fade, replaced by something colder, something heavier. I wasn't just mad. I was hurt. Deep down, I knew this wasn't just about the party or the dress or Tom. This was about something bigger. Rachel didn't respect me. She didn't respect our marriage. And that realization hit me harder than anything else that night. By the time I went to bed, I had made my decision. If she wanted to throw away 7 years of marriage for a party, I wasn't going to stop her. But I wasn't going to stick around to watch it happen, either. You know, I've always been the kind of person who needs facts. Cold, hard facts. Feelings? Sure, they matter. But when you're faced with a situation like this, feelings alone don't cut it. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. So, after Rachel walked out that door, I sat down and I started thinking. I knew what kind of party Sylvia threw. You couldn't be married to Rachel and not know. I'd overheard too many whispered conversations, caught too many side glances between Sylvia and her friends to ignore it. But what I knew wasn't enough, not for me. I needed confirmation, proof. So I made a few calls. The thing about Sylvia's crowd is that they're not as discreet as they think they are. People talk, and over the years, I'd heard plenty from guys who'd been to her parties. Some of them were single, others weren't. But they all had stories. Stories that made my stomach turn. Drugs, alcohol, hookups with strangers. The kind of debauchery that made you wonder how these people went back to their day jobs like nothing happened. I called one of those guys first, Marcus, a former coworker who'd been to Sylvia's parties a few times. Marcus was the kind of guy who liked to brag, so I knew he wouldn't hold back. Sam, my man, Marcus said when he picked up. What's up? Haven't heard from you in ages. Yeah, Marcus, it's been a while, I said, keeping my tone casual. Listen, I've got a question for you. Remember Sylvia? Rachel's friend? Of course. Who could forget Sylvia? Marcus chuckled. Why? You thinking about finally going to one of her parties? About time, man. No, I said firmly. But Rachel's there tonight and I don't know. I've heard things. Wanted to get your take. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You mean like, what really goes on at those parties? Marcus asked. Exactly, I said. What happens after the people who aren't into the extracurricular activities leave? Marcus hesitated, but not for long. Look, Sam, you don't want to know, he said. Seriously, it's not for the faint of heart. But since you asked, yeah, after the boring people leave, things get wild. Real wild. We're talking partner swapping, group stuff, you name it. Sylvia's parties are basically open season for anyone who's into that kind of thing. I clenched my jaw. I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made my blood boil. And Rachel? I asked. Have you ever seen her participate? No, Marcus said quickly. I mean, not that I know of. She sticks around sometimes, but as far as I've seen, she's just a spectator. But Sam, you know how it is. Spectating leads to participating. I'm not saying she's done anything, but if she's still going to those parties. He didn't have to finish the sentence. I knew what he meant. After I hung up with Marcus, I made a few more calls, and the story was always the same. Sylvia's parties were trouble, and Rachel's presence at them was a bad sign. One guy even told me that Sylvia had been trying to convince Rachel to join in for years. She's been saying Rachel just needs a little push, he said. And honestly, Sam, if she hasn't crossed the line yet, it's probably only a matter of time. That last call shook me. I sat there in the dark, the phone still in my hand, and I thought about everything I'd learned. It felt like my worst fears were coming true. Rachel might not have cheated on me yet, but she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and Sylvia was right there, ready to push her over. I wanted to believe that Rachel wouldn't let it happen, that she'd draw the line before things went too far. But the truth was, I didn't know anymore. The Rachel I fell in love with wouldn't have even been at that party, let alone dressed like that for another man. So, yeah, I made a few calls that night. And you might say I was digging for dirt, looking for reasons to justify my anger. But the thing is, I didn't want to be angry. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted someone to tell me that Rachel was just having a good time with her friends, that there was nothing to worry about. But no one did. Instead, they gave me the answers I was dreading. And by the time I went to bed, I knew one thing for certain. Rachel had made her choice. Now, it was time for me to make mine. When Rachel walked out that door, I thought I knew what would happen. I thought she'd go to Sylvia's party, let her hair down, maybe dance with Tom, maybe even flirt a little. I figured she'd come home late, we'd argue, and I'd have a decision to make about our future. What I didn't expect, what I couldn't have predicted, was what really happened that night. It wasn't until much later that I learned the full story, and even now, I struggle to wrap my head around it. Rachel arrived at Sylvia's house just as the party was kicking into gear. Sylvia's parties were infamous for their unpredictability, and this one was no different. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and the air was thick with smoke and laughter. Rachel, dressed to the nines, caught everyone's attention the moment she walked in. She always did have a way of commanding a room, and that night was no exception. Tom, her date, was by her side almost immediately. He hovered around her like a moth to a flame, clearly smitten. Rachel didn't mind the attention. It was flattering, harmless. Or so she thought. She moved through the crowd, greeting colleagues and acquaintances, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, sipping on her drink to calm her nerves. But then things started to blur. Rachel later told me that she couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it happened, but somewhere between her second drink and the third, she started to feel off. Her head was spinning, her limbs felt heavy, and her thoughts were sluggish, like trying to wade through molasses. She told herself it was the alcohol, that she just needed to sit down and rest for a moment. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Sylvia noticed Rachel swaying and stepped in. "You've had too much too fast," Sylvia said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Come on, let's get you to one of the spare rooms so you can lie down." Rachel, too disoriented to argue, let Sylvia lead her away. The room Sylvia brought her to was small but comfortable, with a neatly made bed and heavy curtains that blocked out the noise from the party. Rachel sank onto the bed, grateful for the quiet, and closed her eyes. That's when it started. She wasn't fully unconscious, not at first. She told me she was aware of hands on her, of voices murmuring in the background. She thought it was a dream, or maybe a nightmare, until she heard someone say, "Hurry up, will you? I'm next." That snapped her out of her haze, at least partially. She opened her eyes and saw them, Tom, standing off to the side, and Sylvia, smiling like she'd just won a prize. There were others, too, men Rachel didn't recognize, standing around like they were waiting for their turn. It was a scene straight out of her worst fears, and she was trapped in the middle of it. Rachel tried to fight back, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Whatever they'd given her, later confirmed to be a mix of Rohypnol and ecstasy, had left her too weak to resist. All she could do was lie there, helpless, as they took turns violating her. The next morning, Rachel woke up to find herself alone in the bed. Her head was pounding, her body ached in ways she didn't want to think about, and her dress was crumpled and torn. She felt sick to her stomach, not just from the drugs, but from the sheer horror of what had happened. As she sat up, trying to piece together the night, the door opened, and Bob, one of the men from the night before, walked in. He leaned against the door frame, grinning like they'd just shared some grand adventure. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. "Rachel cheating on Sam. But hey, I'm not complaining. You were incredible." Rachel slapped him. Hard. But the damage was done. She dressed quickly, ignoring Bob's protests, and fled the house. She didn't even look back. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what Rachel already suspected. She'd been drugged. The police were called, and Rachel told them everything she could remember. Sylvia and Tom were at the center of it all, the orchestrators of a night Rachel would never forget. But by the time she got home, I was gone. I never answered her calls, never gave her the chance to explain. To me, her betrayal was clear, and there was nothing she could say to change that. Rachel's lawsuit against Sylvia and Tom came later, after the police had gathered enough evidence to charge them. She won, but it was a hollow victory. The damage was already done. Physically, emotionally, and to our marriage. The thing is, I didn't know any of this at the time. All I had was that phone call from Sylvia at 1 a.m, the sounds of Rachel's betrayal ringing in my ears, and the cold realization that the woman I loved had walked out on me for a night of destruction. By the time Rachel found me and told me the truth, it didn't matter anymore. The Rachel I knew was gone, and the person sitting on my couch was just a shadow of the woman I'd once loved. If there was one person who should have come with a warning label, it was Sylvia. She wasn't just trouble. She was the kind of trouble that didn't look like trouble at first. The charming kind. The kind that smiled while she planted a knife in your back and made you thank her for doing it. And Rachel? She was blind to it, or maybe she just didn't want to see it. You see, Sylvia wasn't just Rachel's best friend. She was a master manipulator. I didn't realize it at first, but the more I thought back, the clearer it became. Sylvia had been working on Rachel for years, slowly chipping away at our marriage, one snide comment and innocent suggestion at a time. It started small, like most manipulation does. Sylvia would make offhand remarks about me when I wasn't around, always cloaked in humor so Rachel wouldn't take them seriously. "Sam's such a stick in the mud," she'd say. "You need to get him to loosen up, Rach. Life's too short to be boring." Rachel would laugh it off, but the seed was planted. Then there were the parties. Sylvia's infamous parties, where Rachel would go to unwind while I stayed home, wanting no part of the chaos. At first, I didn't mind. Everyone needs their space, right? But then the stories started trickling in. Stories from mutual acquaintances, from people who'd been to those parties and seen what went on after the boring guests left. Drugs, drinking, people pairing off into bedrooms that weren't theirs. It didn't take a genius to figure out why I wasn't invited. I tried talking to Rachel about it. "Why do you keep going to those parties?" I asked her one night. "You know what they're like." "They're not as bad as you think, Sam," she said, brushing me off. "Sylvia's my friend, and I'm not going to stop hanging out with her just because you don't like her." And that was the thing. Rachel didn't just like Sylvia, she admired her. Sylvia was bold, confident, unapologetically herself. She was everything Rachel thought she wasn't, and that made her easy to influence. Sylvia knew exactly what she was doing. Over the years, she started planting bigger ideas in Rachel's head. She'd tell Rachel she deserved more fun, more excitement. "Sam's a great guy," she'd say, always with that fake smile. "But don't you ever feel like you're missing out? You're still young, Rach. You should be living it up, not tied down." It was subtle at first, harmless, even. But Sylvia wasn't just making observations. She was laying the groundwork. Slowly but surely, she was convincing Rachel that our marriage was holding her back, that I was holding her back. The worst part? Sylvia wasn't doing it out of concern for Rachel. No, Sylvia thrived on chaos. She loved stirring the pot and watching the fallout. She wanted Rachel to join her in the mud, to become another player in her twisted little games. And when Rachel resisted, Sylvia pushed harder. One night, I overheard part of a phone call between them. Rachel was in the kitchen, her voice low but animated. I wasn't eavesdropping, not intentionally, but I couldn't help but catch snippets. "You know you want to," Sylvia said. "It's not like Sam will ever find out. Just one time. Trust me, you'll love it." Rachel laughed nervously. "I don't know, Sylvia. I can't. Sam would kill me if he even suspected." "Forget Sam," Sylvia said. her tone sharp. You deserve to have some fun for once. Don't let him control you. I didn't hear Rachel's response, but I didn't need to. That conversation confirmed everything I'd been afraid of. Sylvia wasn't just a bad influence. She was actively trying to sabotage our marriage. The night Rachel walked out to go to Sylvia's party, I knew it wasn't just about Tom or the dress. It was about everything Sylvia had been whispering in her ear for years. Live a little. Don't let Sam hold you back. You deserve more. Sylvia had been planting those seeds for so long that when the opportunity came, Rachel didn't just take it, she ran with it. When I got that phone call from Sylvia at 1 a.m., her voice dripping with mock sympathy, it all clicked. She wasn't calling to gloat about Rachel's betrayal. She was calling to finish what she'd started. To twist the knife and make sure I didn't just leave Rachel. I hated her for it. Your wife's finally found a real man, Sylvia said, laughing. Guess you weren't enough after all. I didn't say anything. I just hung up. But in that moment, I realized that Sylvia wasn't just Rachel's problem. She was mine too. She had taken everything I loved and destroyed it, all because she could. When Rachel told me later about what Sylvia had done, how she drugged her, set her up, and orchestrated the assault, it didn't surprise me. It made me sick, sure, but it didn't surprise me. Sylvia had always been a snake. The only difference now was that she'd finally shown her fangs. And Rachel? She was just another casualty of Sylvia's manipulation. The sad part is, I think Rachel knew it too. She just figured it out too late. When Sylvia called me at 1 in the morning, I knew my marriage was over. The words she spoke weren't just taunts. They were confirmation of every fear, every suspicion I had carried for years. Her smugness was the nail in the coffin, but the hammer had been Rachel walking out that door. Sylvia didn't have to say much. Your wife's finally found herself a real man, she'd said, laughing. Here, listen for yourself. And then, I heard it. Muffled sounds, voices, and the unmistakable noises of intimacy. It was like being stabbed in the gut, over and over again. I hung up, but the sound wouldn't leave me. It echoed in my mind, taunting me. 30 seconds later, the phone rang again. I didn't answer. Instead, I yanked the cord from the wall, stared at the silent phone, and made a decision. I packed everything I cared about in an hour. Turns out, you don't realize how little you truly need until you're leaving behind a life. I wasn't running. I was escaping. By 3 a.m., I was in a motel, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had led to this moment. 7 years of marriage, gone in a single night. At 9 a.m., I was at the bank, emptying our accounts. All of them. It wasn't out of spite. Okay, maybe a little. But mostly, it was self-preservation. I didn't know what Rachel would do when she came home and found me gone, but I wasn't about to leave her the resources to chase me. By the time I left town, I was a different man. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the fiery, explosive way I'd been the night before. No, this was something colder. Something quieter. Resignation. Maybe. I didn't just leave Rachel behind. I left behind the man I'd been with her. Castle Rock, Colorado, became my sanctuary. It wasn't planned. I just drove until I found a place that felt far enough from everything. The town was quiet, unassuming, and perfect for someone trying to disappear. I found a job quickly, construction work, something I was good at and didn't have to think too much about. I rented a small apartment and started piecing together a life that didn't include Rachel. It wasn't easy, but it was simple. And after everything that had happened, simplicity was exactly what I needed. But even in the quiet, she haunted me. Not Rachel exactly, but the memories of her. Of us. Of the life we'd built and the life we'd destroyed. Rachel, on the other hand, wasn't quiet. I didn't know it at the time, but she was unraveling in her own way. After the assault at Sylvia's party, she went to the hospital and filed police reports. She sued Sylvia and the men who had violated her, fighting for justice in a world that wasn't kind to victims. She told me later that she spent days crying, wondering where I'd gone, why I hadn't answered her calls. When she finally realized I wasn't coming back, she sold the house, used the money to fund her legal battles, and when the dust settled, she hired a private investigator to find me. It took her 2 years. I didn't recognize her at first when she showed up at my door. The Rachel I knew was confident, vibrant, full of life. The woman sitting on my couch now looked like a ghost of her former self. She told me everything about the drugs, the assault, the lawsuits, and the long, painful road that had led her to me. She cried, begged for forgiveness, told me how much she regretted ever leaving that night. "I didn't cheat on you, Ethan," she said. "Not willingly. I was drugged. I didn't want this." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the thing is, it wasn't the assault that had destroyed us. It wasn't even Sylvia's manipulation. It was the moment Rachel looked me in the eye and walked out that door. She had a choice that night, and she chose someone else, something else, over us. "I warned you, Rachel," I said. "I told you if you walked out that door, you were kissing our marriage goodbye." "I didn't know this would happen," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know Sylvia would." "But you knew what she was," I interrupted. "You knew what those parties were like. You knew what kind of man Tom was. And you still went. You made your choice, Rachel. And I made mine." She cried harder, begged me to give her another chance. But I couldn't. It wasn't just about trust. It was about respect. And the Rachel sitting in front of me wasn't the woman I'd married. I had moved on. Not completely, not in the way you might think, but enough to start over. There was someone else now, Lauren. She wasn't a replacement for Rachel. She was something different, something stable. She understood pain, loss, and what it meant to rebuild yourself. When Lauren walked into the room that night, radiant and confident, she didn't ask about Rachel. She didn't need to. She looked at Rachel, smiled, and said, "Thank you for sending Ethan to me." It was the final nail in the coffin, the closure I didn't even know I needed. Rachel might have been searching for redemption, but I had already found mine. In the quiet life I'd built, in the peace I'd fought so hard to earn. 2 years. That's how long it took Rachel to find me. 2 years of searching, of following breadcrumbs, of chasing shadows. I didn't make it easy for her. I didn't want to be found. But Rachel? She was determined. Stubborn. Really. The kind of stubborn that made me love her once. And maybe, just maybe, the same kind of stubborn that ruined us. After I left, Rachel's world fell apart. Not just because of what happened at Sylvia's party, though that was bad enough. No, it was the realization that I was gone, that I wasn't coming back. She told me later that she cried for days when she came home to find the house empty. No note, no explanation. Just a vacuum where our life together used to be. Her first instinct was to call me. Of course, she didn't know I'd already tossed the phone that connected us. When she couldn't reach me, she started calling friends, family, anyone who might know where I'd gone. But I'd planned for that. No one knew, and the few who did weren't talking. Left with no other options, Rachel focused on the only thing she could control: justice. She pressed charges against Sylvia and the men who assaulted her that night. She fought tooth and nail in court, reliving the worst moments of her life over and over again. And when the dust settled, she won. Sylvia lost everything: her reputation, her freedom, her house. Rachel sold that house and used the money to hire a private investigator to track me down. I have to give her credit. She was relentless. The investigator followed every lead, every paper trail I thought I'd erased. Eventually, he found me in Castle Rock, Colorado, living a quiet, unremarkable life. And just like that, Rachel was on my doorstep. Castle Rock wasn't just a place to me. It was a second chance. A chance to rebuild, to start over. When I left Rachel, I didn't just leave our marriage. I left the version of myself that existed with her. The version that was angry, resentful, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Here, I built something better. My apartment was small, my job was straightforward, and my life was blissfully uncomplicated. I spent my days working with my hands, and my nights were quiet. I even started dating again, though I swore to myself I'd never marry. That's how I met Lauren. Lauren wasn't like Rachel. She was grounded, steady. She carried her own scars, her own stories of loss, but she didn't let them define her. Being with her was easy in a way my marriage never was. No games, no secrets, no third-party influences whispering in her ear. She didn't need to be saved, and neither did I. When Rachel showed up, it was like seeing a ghost. She looked different, older, thinner, like life had worn her down. I guess I looked different too, but not in the way she expected. She told me everything, about the assault, the lawsuits, the private investigator. She cried, apologized, begged for another chance. I didn't cheat on you, Ethan, she said. I was drugged. I didn't want any of this to happen. I believed her. But here's the thing. It didn't matter. The assault was horrific, and no one deserved what she went through. But that wasn't what broke us. What broke us was the moment she walked out that door, knowing full well what Sylvia's parties were like, knowing how I felt about it. She chose to leave, and I chose to move on. I warned you, Rachel, I said. I told you that if you walked out that door, you were kissing our marriage goodbye. You didn't listen. I didn't know this would happen, she pleaded, her voice cracking. I didn't know Sylvia would. But you knew what kind of person she was, I interrupted. You knew what kind of party she threw. You chose to go anyway. She tried to argue, but I stopped her. It's not about what happened to you, Rachel. It's about what you did before it happened. You didn't respect me enough to stay. That's why we're over. Lauren walked in at that moment, radiant as always. She took one look at Rachel and smiled. You must be Rachel, she said, her voice warm but firm. Ethan's told me about you. Thank you for sending him my way. Rachel's jaw tightened, and I could see the heartbreak in her eyes. But she didn't say anything. What could she say? Lauren wasn't a rebound or a replacement. She was proof that I could find happiness again, that I could rebuild my life without Rachel in it. Rachel left in tears that night, and I haven't seen her since. Maybe she stayed in Castle Rock, hoping I'd change my mind. Maybe she moved on, found someone else. I don't know. What I do know is that I made the right choice. For me, for Lauren, for the life I've built. Rachel might have been my past, but Lauren was my future. Rachel didn't leave that night for good. Not right away. She was stubborn, always had been, and the years hadn't changed that. She wanted answers, wanted me to see her side of the story, and most of all, she wanted us back. But here's the thing. There wasn't an us anymore. Not in the way she thought. The next morning, I wasn't surprised to find her waiting outside my apartment building. She looked like she hadn't slept, her face pale and her eyes puffy from crying. Part of me pitied her, but a larger part of me was just tired. Tired of the drama, the explanations, the cycle of excuses. When I walked past her without a word, she called out, Ethan, please. We need to talk. I stopped, turned to her, and said, There's nothing left to talk about, Rachel. You walked out on me. I moved on. It's that simple. It's not simple, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't choose what happened to me, Ethan. I was drugged. I was assaulted. How can you hold that against me? I sighed, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm not holding that against you, Rachel. What happened to you was horrific, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But it's not the reason we're done. The reason is that you ignored me. You disrespected me. I told you what would happen if you walked out that door, and you did it anyway. She stared at me, stunned, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I thought you loved me, she said quietly. I did, I replied. But love isn't enough when there's no respect. You chose Sylvia, her parties, and everything that came with them over me, over us. And now, I've chosen to move on. Lauren was waiting for me when I got upstairs. She could tell something was off. She always could. Was it Rachel? She asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. I nodded. She's still hoping she can fix things. Lauren didn't react the way I expected. No jealousy, no anger. Just a calm, understanding look. She's hurting, she said. But that doesn't mean she can undo the past. That's what I loved about Lauren. She didn't push, didn't demand. She let me work through my emotions at my own pace, but she was always there when I needed her. She was the opposite of everything I'd endured with Rachel. Steady, supportive, and real. Over the next few days, Rachel tried again and again to reach me. Calls, texts, even showing up at my workplace once. Each time, I made it clear there was no going back. The final straw came when she knocked on my door late one evening, her voice shaking as she said, I'm not giving up on us, Ethan. I'll fight for you if I have to. I opened the door just wide enough to look her in the eye. Rachel, there is no us to fight for. I've moved on. You need to do the same. But I love you, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I can't just let you go. I shook my head. You already did, Rachel. The night you walked out that door, you let me go. And now, it's time for you to let yourself go, too. You deserve a fresh start, but it's not going to be with me. That was the last time I saw her. She didn't say anything else, just turned and walked away. And this time, I knew she wasn't coming back. Lauren walked into the room after Rachel left, her presence instantly grounding me. She's gone, she asked softly. I nodded. Yeah, for good this time. Lauren smiled, a small, knowing smile that carried no judgment. Good, because I don't intend to let you go. She didn't need to say more. We both knew where we stood. Lauren wasn't just my girlfriend. She was my future. She'd helped me rebuild myself piece by piece, not by trying to fix me, but by giving me the space to heal on my own. She didn't demand. She simply stayed. And that, more than anything, made me realize how much I'd needed her. Rachel was my past, a chapter of my life that had closed long before I left. She tried to reopen it, but the ink had dried, and the pages couldn't be rewritten. Lauren? She was my present and my future. With her, I didn't just find love again. I found peace. That night, as Lauren and I headed out for dinner, I felt lighter than I had in years. Rachel's shadow was finally gone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free to live, free to love, and free to leave the past where it belonged. Behind me.